The tide does not return to the shore because it has resolved its relationship with the moon. It returns because it has no choice, and the shore, mistaking compulsion for intention, calls it love. They came back. Whatever form it took, the message that arrived after a silence so long you had almost recalibrated your interior life around their permanent absence, the reappearance in the peripheral spaces of your world that was too deliberate to be coincidence. The phone call that began with a casualness so studied it communicated the opposite of what it was performing, or simply the direct, unambiguous reaching out that you had spent months simultaneously dreading and hoping for. They came back. And the moment they did, something happened in you that all the work of the intervening months, all the hard-won distance you had placed between yourself and the hoping, could not entirely prevent. You felt it. The specific, irrational, entirely human resurgence of something you had been working to put down. Not just the feeling for them, though that was present, probably immediately, with the disorienting intensity of something that had not actually diminished so much as gone underground, but the hope. The specific hope that the return means what you want it to mean, that the silence was a period of growth, that the distance produced the clarity that your presence couldn't, that the person who came back is in some meaningful way different from the person who left or who pushed you into leaving, and that the return is the beginning of the story you always believed was possible between you. This hope is understandable. It is human. It is the natural, almost inevitable response of genuine love encountering the person it never quite finished with, and it deserves to be treated with respect rather than dismissed as weakness or delusion. But it also deserves to be treated with honesty, with the specific honesty of someone who understands the avoidant psychology well enough to ask not just why they came back, but why now? What generated the return, what the return is actually made of beneath the warmth of its surface, and to hold the answers with clear eyes rather than through the softening lens of wanting the return to be what it might not yet be. Why they came back, the real reasons beneath the obvious ones. The first thing to understand about the avoidance return is that it almost never has a single cause. It is not as simple as missing you, though missing you is almost certainly present. It is not as simple as having grown or changed or done the internal work that the relationship originally required, and that their leaving or their pushing you into leaving made impossible. It is a confluence, several distinct forces arriving simultaneously or in rapid succession, creating a pressure that the avoidance usual management strategies cannot adequately contain, and that eventually produces the action of reaching back toward you as the only available relief. The first and most honest of these forces is loss registration. The avoidant, whose attachment system suppresses the significance of connection in real time, who genuinely cannot feel the full weight of what a person means to them while that person is present and available and therefore still manageable, begins to feel it in absence. Not immediately. The initial period of absence often brings the relief that the avoidant predicted it would. The pressure of intimacy lifts. The vigilance that closeness required relaxes. The familiar equilibrium of self-sufficiency reasserts itself, and for a window of time, the avoidant inhabits it with something that genuinely resembles peace. But the window closes, and what follows the closing is the slow, accumulating registration of what the absence actually contains. The specific weight of your particular absence, with all the irreplaceable qualities that made you distinct from every other person who has moved through their life. This registration does not arrive all at once. It builds. It compounds. It attaches itself to ordinary moments. The evening that has changed texture, the instinctive reach toward a connection that no longer answers, the involuntary comparison of every subsequent person against the template your presence created and found inadequate. the registration becomes undeniable, and the avoidant, sitting inside the undeniable weight of it, begins to move toward the only action that the weight suggests. Return. The second force generating the return is what might be called comparative diminishment, the specific, demoralizing process of discovering, through contact with the world of people who are not you, that what existed between you was not ordinary. The avoidant, freed from the pressure of your closeness, often moves outward, into new connections, new interactions, new encounters with people who represent the uncomplicated early ease of someone who does not yet know them well enough to require anything. These encounters bring their own temporary relief, the lightness of connection without depth, the pleasure of being perceived positively without the vulnerability of being perceived truly. But depth, once experienced, does not allow its absence to go unnoticed. The avoidant who has been genuinely close to you, who has experienced, however briefly and however resistantly, the specific quality of being known by someone whose knowing was both perceptive and kind, finds that the connections available in your absence carry a hollowness that was not present before you. Not because the people they encounter are insufficient in some absolute sense, but because they are insufficient in the specific sense of not being you, of not possessing the particular combination of qualities that made your presence in the avoidant's life the specific, weighted, irreplaceable thing it was. This comparative diminishment is not something the avoidant can easily dismiss or rationalize away, because it does not operate at the level of thought where rationalization functions most effectively. It operates at the level of felt experience, in the quality of how interactions feel, rather than in any accessible difference in the qualities the interactions possess. And felt experience, unlike thought, does not yield to argument. The avoidant comes back in part because the world without you has demonstrated, with a thoroughness that the world with you never quite could, how rare you are. The third force is time's particular effect on the avoidant's suppression. The avoidant's psychological defenses are sophisticated and in the short to medium term remarkably effective, but they are not permanent. They are not infinitely durable against the specific erosion that genuine unfelt grief applies to them over time. Every feeling that was not felt at the appropriate moment does not disappear. It is stored, and storage has a capacity. And when the capacity is approached, when the accumulated weight of suppressed grief and unprocessed loss and unfelt love reaches a certain threshold, things begin to surface that the defenses were designed to keep submerged. The return sometimes happens because the avoidance suppression has been worn thin by time, and what is surfacing through the thinning is the real, unmanaged, unprotected experience of having lost you. Not the composed, intellectualized acknowledgement of loss that the avoidant is capable of quite early. Yes, we ended. Yes, it is unfortunate. Yes, I have some regret about certain aspects of how things went, but the actual felt visceral experience of loss that the suppression was holding at bay, the grief arriving finally and without the anesthetic of the defenses that have been maintaining its distance. Grief, when it arrives at this depth, produces action. It produces the reaching back, the reaching out, the attempt to close the distance between the present and the version of the present in which you were still there. It may not produce the right action. Grief-driven return is not the same as growth-driven return, and the difference is everything. But it produces the return. Why not? The harder, more necessary question. And now the harder question. The one that the warmth of the return makes difficult to ask, and that the hope the return generates makes it tempting to defer indefinitely. Not why they came back, but why the coming back may not be enough. Why the return, in the absence of something more specific and more substantive than return, is not the answer to the question the relationship was always asking. The avoidant came back, but did they come back changed? Or did they come back the same person who left, or who generated the conditions that made leaving necessary, carrying the same unexamined patterns, the same insufficient tools for genuine intimacy, the same incapacity for the sustained accountability and emotional presence that the relationship always required and never quite received? This distinction is the most important discernment available to you in this moment, and it is genuinely difficult to make clearly because the avoidant who returns often returns with a quality of warmth and presence that is real, not performed, genuinely felt, and that can make the distinction between genuine change and anxiety-driven return almost impossible to see in the early days of the reunion. The warmth is not fake. The desire to be different is not fake. The relief of being back in your presence, the specific, irreplaceable relief of the person who has spent months in the comparative diminishment of a world without you, now returned to the specific warmth of who you are, is entirely genuine. But relief is not change. Desire for different outcomes is not the same as the capacity to produce them. And the avoidant who returns full of genuine feeling and genuine desire without the genuine internal work that would make sustained change possible is not bringing you a new relationship. They are bringing you the same relationship, temporarily reanimated by the intensity of reunion that will, in time, once the anxiety of loss has been relieved and the familiar equilibrium of your presence has been restored, begin to produce the same dynamics that defined it before. What genuine return looks like and what it does not. Genuine return, the kind that is worth receiving, that represents something substantively different from what existed before, has specific, observable characteristics that distinguish it from the anxiety-driven, loss-motivated return that the majority of avoidant comebacks represent. Genuine return comes with an accounting, not a performance of accountability, not the tearful admission that is designed to produce your forgiveness rather than to genuinely acknowledge your experience, but a real, honest reckoning with the specific ways their behavior affected you. Not a general acknowledgement that things were not ideal. Specific acknowledgement, named moments, named patterns, named impacts. The willingness to stand in the direct, uncomfortable light of what their behavior cost you and to remain in that light without deflecting, without reframing, without the subtle redirection toward their own pain that converts accountability into a bid for sympathy. Genuine return comes with evidence of internal work, not the promise of future effort, the avoidant's most reliable and most frequently broken offering, but evidence that the time of absence was used, that something happened in them during the period of separation that was not simply the accumulation of loss until the loss became unbearable. Therapy, engaged with honestly. A genuine examination of the attachment patterns that generated the relationship's most consistent wounds. A changed relationship with their own emotional experience, an increased capacity to feel rather than suppress, to name rather than bury, to sit inside difficulty rather than escape it. This evidence does not need to be complete. Genuine internal work is never complete, and a person who claims to have fully resolved their avoidant attachment in the months of absence is either lying or has not understood the depth of what genuine resolution requires. But it needs to be present, real, verifiable through the quality of how they engage with you rather than through the quality of what they say about themselves. Genuine return comes with a changed tolerance for the conversations that previously caused retreat. The specific test, the most reliable one available, is how they respond when you express the impact of their absence, the hurt generated by the patterns that defined the relationship, the needs that went unmet during the time you were together. Do they stay? Do they receive it without immediate deflection? Do they allow your experience to land in them as something real and consequential rather than as an attack to be managed or a wound to be immediately healed through the reassurance that everything will be different now? The changed capacity to sit inside the discomfort of having caused harm, to remain in the conversation that requires accountability without fleeing into minimization or into the sudden emotional unavailability that the avoidance system generates under relational pressure, is one of the clearest available indicators that something has genuinely shifted in the architecture of their attachment. What you are allowed to want and what you are allowed to require. You are allowed to want them back. The wanting does not require justification or apology. It is the straightforward consequence of having loved someone real, and love that was real does not simply dissolve because the relationship that housed it ended, or because the person who generated it behaved in ways that the love did not deserve. But you are also allowed, more than allowed, you are owed, the right to require something specific from the return before you receive it fully. Not as punishment, not as the retaliatory withholding of a person who is trying to balance a perceived score, but as the basic, non-negotiable acknowledgement of your own worth, the understanding that what you bring to a relationship is valuable enough that it should not be offered to someone who has not demonstrated, through changed behavior rather than renewed feeling, that they now have the capacity to meet it with the presence and the accountability it has always deserved. What you are allowed to require is simple, though requiring it will not feel simple. You are allowed to require evidence over time rather than promises in the moment. You are allowed to require that the accountability be specific and that it arrive without your having to extract it. You are allowed to require that the patterns that hurt you be named by them, not described to you as their problem to manage, but acknowledged as impacts they had on you, with the full weight of that acknowledgement landing in the shared space between you rather than being managed as their private psychological project. You are allowed to move slowly. The avoidance return often comes with an implicit pressure toward rapid restoration, the desire to return quickly to the warmth of what existed before the ending, to skip over the difficult intermediate territory of genuine reckoning and arrive directly at the reunion. This pressure is understandable. The avoidant is relieved to be back in your presence and genuinely does not want to spend the early days of the return in the discomfort of accounting, but the skipping is not in your interest. The intermediate territory is where the evidence lives. It is where the difference between genuine change and anxiety-driven return becomes visible. Moving through it slowly, requiring it to be moved through rather than bypassed, is not obstruction. It is the entirely reasonable behavior of someone who has been hurt before and is not willing to be hurt in the same way again without better evidence that different is genuinely possible. The question beneath all the questions. Every person who has loved an avoidant and received their return eventually arrives at a question that sits beneath all the specific questions about why and whether and what it means. It is not really a question about the avoidant at all, though it is generated by them and lives in the specific context of the choice their return has placed before you. It is a question about yourself. What do you believe you deserve? Not in the abstract affirmational sense of the question. Not what do you believe in principle that all people deserve, which is easy to answer because it costs nothing. But specifically, personally, in the lived reality of this relationship with this person who hurt you and left and has now returned, what do you actually believe you deserve from a love that claims to be real? Because what you believe at this depth will determine everything. It will determine how you receive the return, with the open-handed generosity of someone who has already decided that the wanting is enough, or with the clear-eyed discernment of someone who knows that the wanting must be accompanied by the changed capacity to act on it differently. It will determine what you require and what you settle for, and whether you are able to hold the line between those two things when the warmth of the reunion and the relief of the return make the line feel like an obstacle rather than a protection. You deserve a love that repairs what it breaks, a love that can name its own impact, a love that shows up not only in the intensity of feeling, but in the sustained, unglamorous, daily practice of choosing you. Not because the anxiety of your absence has made you temporarily irreplaceable, but because the reality of your presence has been understood, valued, and actively chosen to be kept. The avoidant came back. That is real. The feeling that generated the return is real. The loss they experienced in your absence is real, and the rarity they recognized in you through the lens of that loss is real. But real feeling in a person without the current capacity to act on it differently is not yet a relationship. It is the raw material of one. And raw material, however genuine, requires the willingness to be shaped through accountability, through sustained work, through the daily, imperfect, courageous practice of being different, before it becomes the thing it has the potential to become. The return is the beginning of a question, not the answer to one. And you, clear-eyed, self-respecting, entirely aware of what the relationship cost you and what it showed you about your own worth, are the one who gets to decide whether the question is worth pursuing. Not because of what they feel, because of what they are willing to do with it. That distinction is everything. It always was.